He ruled New York with blood and fear for 12 years. But the one person who could destroy everything he built was the woman lying in a hospital bed he never came back to. The ring hit his palm like a verdict. No tears, no screaming, just her eyes. Calm, final, already gone, before the elevator doors closed between them forever. If you've ever loved someone who chose power over you, stay until the end. This story will wreck you. Hit like, drop your city in the comments, and let me see how far this reaches. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and dying flowers. The kind of place where people made promises they couldn't keep, and God collected the receipts anyway. Lucien Devereaux hated hospitals. He hated the way the fluorescent lights made everyone look half dead already. He hated the sound of rubber soles squeaking against linoleum, the low mechanical hum of machines breathing for people who couldn't breathe on their own. He hated, most of all, what hospitals represented. The one territory where his name carried no weight, where no amount of money or menace could negotiate with the body's quiet rebellion against itself. He told himself he was coming back. That was the lie he'd been carrying since 3 o'clock that morning, when his phone buzzed with Vanessa's number, and he'd eased himself out of the chair beside Evelyn's bed, careful not to wake the nurses, careful not to think too hard about what he was doing. He told himself it would be 2 hours, maybe 3. A quick appointment, prenatal checkup. He'd be back before Evelyn opened her eyes. That was 14 hours ago. He walked through the lobby now with Vanessa's arm threaded through his, her perfume so heavy it almost covered the smell of the place, her laughter too bright for the acoustics of a building full of sick people. She was saying something about names, and Mateo, she liked Mateo, or maybe something more classic, something that sounded like old money. And Lucien was half listening, his hand resting at the small of her back, his mind already running calculations about a shipment delayed in Rotterdam and a judge in Queens who'd stopped returning calls. He wasn't thinking about Evelyn. That was the truest and most damning thing about that moment. He simply wasn't thinking about her. The elevator at the far end of the lobby chimed. The doors opened. And the world, as Lucien Devereaux had always known it, ended without a single gunshot. She was standing there in a hospital gown, pale as plaster, one hand wrapped around the silver pole of an IV stand. Her dark hair was loose, uncombed, something he'd never seen in 12 years of marriage, because Evelyn always composed herself before she let anyone look at her. Her feet were bare on the cold floor. She'd clearly pulled herself out of bed without calling a nurse, without telling anyone, and the effort of standing upright was visible in the tension along her jaw, the slight lean into the IV pole that she was working very hard to disguise. She looked at Lucien. She looked at Vanessa. She looked at where his hand rested against Vanessa's lower back. She took all of it in over the course of maybe 2 seconds, the way someone processes a car accident, not with chaos, but with a strange, terrible clarity that burns every detail into permanent memory. Lucien's hand dropped from Vanessa's back. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Vanessa went rigid beside him. She'd heard about Evelyn the way you hear about weather, something powerful and distant that affected other people's lives. Standing 15 feet away from her now, watching the wife look at her with those devastatingly quiet eyes, Vanessa felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Small. She felt extraordinarily small. Evelyn stepped out of the elevator. Her feet were silent on the floor. The IV pole rolled beside her with a soft rattle that sounded obscenely loud in the silence that had swallowed the lobby. 2 orderlies near the reception desk noticed and started to move toward her, but something in her posture stopped them. She walked with the careful, deliberate steadiness of someone who has decided exactly what they are going to do and is simply executing it. She stopped in front of Lucien. She was shorter than Vanessa. She'd always been shorter than most people imagined when they heard the name Evelyn Devereaux. They expected someone imposing because the name had weight. But she was small-framed and fine-boned, and standing there in a hospital gown with an IV drip and bare feet, she looked like something breakable. She didn't look broken. She lifted her left hand. The diamond caught the fluorescent light and threw small fractured rainbows across Lucien's shirt. She'd worn that ring for 12 years. He'd slid it onto her finger in a church in Tuscany, in the early days when he'd still believed that loving someone and possessing someone were different things. He remembered the way her hand had trembled slightly. Nerves, she'd said, just nerves, and how he'd held it steady with both of his. She pulled the ring off now with 2 fingers, slow and deliberate, The way you remove something that no longer belongs to you. She placed it in his palm. She closed his fingers around it. Her hand was cold. It occurred to him distantly that her hand was cold because she'd walked through corridors with no shoes and the hospital kept the temperature low, and she was sick, genuinely sick, and she'd gotten out of bed and walked down here because she had to see it herself, because maybe a part of her hadn't believed it until she saw it with her own eyes. She smiled. He would remember that smile for the rest of his life. Not cruel, not shattered, not performing anything, just the quiet, final expression of someone who has arrived at a decision they've been approaching for longer than they realized, and found, on the far side of it, something like peace. She said nothing. She walked away. The IV pole rattled softly as she went. A nurse appeared at the corridor junction and moved toward her, and Evelyn said something low and calm that made the nurse nod and fall into step beside her. The elevator doors opened again. She stepped inside without looking back. The doors closed. Lucian stood in the lobby with his wife's wedding ring in his fist and a woman he'd ruined everything for standing beside him in expensive perfume, and the silence in his chest was so complete it felt structural, like something load-bearing had just been removed. Lucian. Vanessa's voice was careful, measured. She would have found out eventually. Stop. The word came out flat and absolute. Don't say another word. She stopped. He looked down at his closed hand. The ring was warm now, warmed by his palm, and he thought with sudden nauseating clarity about the fact that she'd been wearing it in a hospital bed, sick, waiting for him to come back, and it had been warm from her body heat then too. He'd told himself he was coming back. The Devereaux family's legal team received the divorce documents before midnight. Lucian was sitting in his car in the hospital parking garage when his phone lit up. First his personal attorney, then the family's senior counsel, then a number from the legal firm that handled the estate's most sensitive structures. He let them ring. He sat in the leather seat of a car that cost more than most people's houses, in a city that had feared his name for over a decade, and he stared at the ring sitting in the cup holder where he'd set it down because he couldn't keep holding it. He didn't go back inside. He told himself he would handle it in the morning. He was very good at telling himself things. The document that arrived with the divorce filing was 7 pages of legal language and 1 handwritten page that his attorney described, voice carefully neutral, as a personal letter from Mrs. Devereaux. His attorney read him the relevant line over the phone because Lucian had asked him to summarize, and the man was precise in a way Lucian usually appreciated. I will never compete with another woman for a man who willingly walked away. No demands for money, no claim on the Devereaux fortune, which was vast and layered and would have taken years and small armies of lawyers to fully map. She wanted the divorce processed cleanly. She wanted her name back. She wanted, her attorney had specified in a follow-up communication, only her freedom. Lucian's senior counsel called it the most unusual divorce filing he'd seen in 31 years of practice. What came next was worse. It started with a phone call from the director of Meridian Capital Group, a legitimate investment firm that had been operating under the Devereaux financial umbrella for 9 years. The director, a careful man named Prescott, who wore the same style of wire-rimmed glasses he'd worn since 1987, called to inform Lucian that ownership of Meridian had been transferred. The documentation was clean, legal, signed, and had apparently been structured years in advance against exactly this contingency. The new sole owner was Evelyn Ashford. She'd already reverted to her maiden name, effective immediately. Lucian had told Prescott to check again. Prescott checked, twice. The answer didn't change. Over the following 72 hours, it became clear that the Meridian transfer was not an isolated event. Ashford Hotel Group, 3 properties in Manhattan, 1 in Chicago, 2 in Miami, transferred. The Ashford Foundation, which ran community development programs and had deep ties to city government, transferred. 2 architectural firms that bore no obvious connection to the Devereaux name but had operated quietly within his financial network for years, transferred. Investment vehicles. Real estate holding companies. A consulting group that had worked with foreign governments on infrastructure contracts. All of it moved cleanly out of his reach. The total was staggering, not because of the raw numbers, though the numbers were staggering, but because of what the transfers revealed. Lucian had believed, in the way powerful men believe things they've never bothered to verify, that these enterprises existed because of him, his name, his protection, his capacity for violence deployed judiciously in the right moments. What the documentation showed was something else entirely. Evelyn had built them. Not supervised, not presided over. Built, from the structural foundations up, in the years before the marriage became what it became, in the gaps and margins and quiet hours while Lucian was doing the things he told himself were necessary. She had used his name as a shield and his resources as seed capital, but the architecture, the relationships, the strategic thinking that had made those enterprises valuable, that had been hers. She had simply allowed him to believe otherwise. Because, he understood now, she had been protecting herself long before she'd consciously known she needed to. His financial lieutenant, a man named Garza, who'd been with the family for 18 years and was not given to dramatics, came to Lucian's office on the fourth day and set a single sheet of paper on the desk. It was a preliminary assessment of the damage to legitimate revenue streams. "The number?" Lucian asked. Garza told him. Lucian looked out the window at the city for a long time. "The families," he said finally, meaning the other Mafia families, the ones who'd operated at respectful distance for a decade because they'd calculated that crossing Devereaux wasn't worth the cost. How long before they start making moves? Garza's pause was its own answer. "I'd say they already are," Garza said. "There were 2 incidents in Brooklyn last night. A supplier in the Bronx is saying he's had a better offer, and Carlucci's people have been making calls." Carlucci. Lucian had intimidated Carlucci into compliance at a dinner in 2019 by having 3 of his associates quietly removed from the room and not returned until certain understandings were reached. Carlucci had been obedient ever since. Now Carlucci was making calls. "Because they think I'm weak," Lucian said. "Because," Garza said carefully, "the people who made you look strong are no longer in the room." Lucian sat with that for a while after Garza left. The office was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows, art he'd bought because someone told him it was valuable, furniture chosen by a designer whose name he couldn't remember. It had always felt like power made physical. Right now it felt like a stage set, elaborate and hollow. His phone had been ringing all day. Vanessa, mostly. She'd cycled through hurt and angry and placating and was currently somewhere in the territory of strategic, calling from different numbers when he declined the primary line. She wanted to discuss the situation. She wanted to establish clarity about her position. She wanted, he understood, to figure out what was left to be gained. He'd stopped answering 2 days ago. He had his people begin searching for Evelyn on the 5th day, when it became clear she wasn't going to surface on her own, and he'd started waking at 3 in the morning with the specific weight of something he couldn't name pressing against his ribs. She had checked herself out of the hospital on the same day she'd walked into that lobby. The attending physician had protested. She'd signed a waiver, dressed herself, and walked out. There were cameras at the hospital's main entrance that caught her getting into a car. A private car service, not a Devereaux vehicle. And that was the last clean image anyone had of her. No credit card activity on any account connected to her name. No phone pings. No contact with any of the social or professional acquaintances his investigators had mapped in the first 72 hours. She'd had contingency plans in place, which meant she'd been planning this, not this exact confrontation, he thought, but the possibility of this, the need for a clean exit, for longer than he wanted to think about. His best investigator, a former intelligence officer named Harwick, who'd found people who didn't want to be found in 4 countries, called on the 12th day with a progress report. The progress report was 4 words. She doesn't want finding. "Everyone leaves traces," Lucian said. "Yes, right," Harwick agreed. "But she left the traces she wanted to leave and didn't leave the ones she didn't. That's a different problem than finding someone who just ran." Lucian absorbed this. "She planned it," he said. "She planned the possibility of it," Harwick said. "There's a difference. She wasn't running from something she knew was coming. She was ready, in case it did." The distinction felt important in a way that made Lucian's chest tight. She hadn't been plotting against him. She'd been protecting herself, quietly, persistently, for years, building a life that could survive the life they were living together. She'd been the architect of her own survival, while he'd been busy believing he was the only thing keeping everything standing. He sat alone in the mansion that night. Evelyn's piano was in the east sitting room, a Steinway she'd played every evening when they were first married, not performing, just playing for herself, the way she did everything that mattered to her. She'd stopped playing it somewhere around the 7th year, and he'd noticed but hadn't asked. The way he'd stopped asking about a lot of things when the empire got heavy enough that other things fell away. The piano was covered in a week's worth of dust now. Nobody had touched it. He stood in the doorway of the sitting room and looked at it for a long time. The silence coming off that covered piano was the loudest thing in the house. He'd sent 300 soldiers and every private resource he had into a city that had swallowed her whole, and she was somewhere out there, sick or recovering. He didn't know. He couldn't know. Building whatever came next. Without him. Without the name he'd thought was the most powerful thing in either of their lives. He was still standing in that doorway when Garza called with news from Brooklyn that required his immediate attention, and Lucian put the phone to his ear and answered in the voice the city recognized, hard and flat and final. But his eyes stayed on the piano. And somewhere in the back of his mind, behind the logistics of violence and the calculations of power, a question he couldn't answer had started its slow, relentless work. What if the most dangerous thing he'd ever done wasn't a war he'd fought or an enemy he'd broken? What if it was the morning he'd slipped out of a hospital room to take a phone call, telling himself he was coming back, and never did? What if the woman who'd walked away with bare feet on a cold hospital floor had been, all along, the only thing holding the whole empire together? He didn't have an answer yet, but in 6 years, kneeling on marble in front of a child with his own eyes and her calm, undestroyable smile, he would understand that the question had already decided everything. The divorce was finalized 41 days later. By then, Evelyn Ashford had already vanished so completely that even Harwick had quietly closed his file. And somewhere in the machinery of the Devereaux Empire, a crack no one had noticed was beginning, slowly, irrevocably, to spread. The first thing that went was sleep. Not all at once. It wasn't dramatic like that. It wasn't a single night where Lucien lay staring at the ceiling and understood that something fundamental had shifted. It was gradual, the way rot works through wood, invisible until the surface gives under pressure. He'd doze for 2, maybe 3 hours, then surface from dreams he couldn't hold on to, sweating through a shirt that cost $400 in a bed that was too large and too cold on one side. He'd lie there listening to the house breathe around him. The groan of old pipes, the distant sound of the security team doing their rotations on the grounds. And he'd run the numbers in his head the way he used to run them when the empire was growing, when the math always came out right. The math didn't come out right anymore. 41 days after Evelyn walked into that elevator and the doors closed on 12 years of marriage, the Devereaux financial structure looked like a building with its load-bearing walls removed. Standing, technically. For now. Garza brought the consolidated report on a Tuesday morning, setting it on Lucian's desk with the particular careful movement of a man delivering bad news to someone with a documented history of violent responses to bad news. The report was 40 pages. Lucian read the executive summary, then the first 3 pages, then stopped and looked up. "How bad is the Brooklyn situation?" he asked. Garza pulled at his collar. He'd been doing that a lot lately, this small reflexive tug, like the shirt was strangling him. "Carlucci's people have moved into 2 distribution points we've held for 7 years. They're not hiding it. They want us to know." And our response was? "We sent 8 men Thursday night." And? Carlucci had 16. The room was quiet for a moment. "Casualties?" Lucian asked. 2 hours. None theirs." Garza paused. "They let our men walk away, Lucian. They let them walk away on purpose so they could come back and tell us what happened. That was the part that stung. Not the loss of the territory, not even the violence. Those were the normal grammar of the business, a language Lucian had been speaking since he was 19 years old. What stung was the message embedded in the mercy. Carlucci wasn't afraid of him anymore. Carlucci had done the math and decided the calculation had changed, and he was now communicating that decision the way men in their world communicated everything important. Not with words, but with actions calibrated for maximum psychological effect. He let your men walk so they could come back humiliated, because humiliation travels faster than blood. "Set up a meeting," Lucian said. "With Carlucci? With everyone." He said it flatly, the way you say something you've already decided. "The Ferrano family, Bianchi's people, Ochoa, all of them. I want a table." Garza hesitated, which was unusual. Garza didn't hesitate. "They may read a meeting request as weakness. I know. Lucian leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked. Set it up anyway. After Garza left, Lucian sat with the 40-page report and the particular silence that had colonized the mansion since Evelyn's piano went unplayed. He thought about the 8 men he'd sent to Brooklyn who'd come back with their heads down. And he thought about the 16 men Carlucci had waiting for them. And he understood with a clarity that was almost physical that the problem wasn't numbers. The problem was that for 12 years, rivals had done the math on Lucien Devereaux and concluded that starting a war with him wasn't worth it. Not because of his soldiers or his weapons or his political connections, though those had all been real, but because the man operated with a precision and a strategic patience that made him unpredictable in the worst possible way. You never knew which move was bait and which was genuine, because the person calculating 3 moves ahead wasn't always the person in the room. Harwick had told him. Garza had told him. He hadn't wanted to hear it. The people who made you look strong are no longer in the room. Vanessa was waiting in the East Corridor when he came out of the office. She'd been doing this, appearing in corridors, in rooms, in the peripheral vision of his day, with increasing frequency over the past 2 weeks, each appearance a small negotiation, a repositioning. She was wearing a cream-colored dress and had done something careful with her hair, and she looked, he thought distantly, like a woman preparing for a performance. "You're avoiding me," she said. "I'm busy." "You're always busy. You used to make time." He stopped walking. There was a particular kind of conversation he'd been putting off, and he could feel it arriving now the way you feel weather change, pressure dropping, air going still before the break. "What do you want, Vanessa?" "I want to know where I stand." She held her ground, which he credited her for. "The appointment last week. The doctor wants to see me again for follow-up tests, and I need to know whether you're going to be there, and I need to know what did the tests come back as?" She blinked. "What?" "The follow-up tests." He watched her face. "What's the concern?" Something moved through her expression, quick enough that he almost missed it. Not guilt exactly. Something more complicated, a rapid internal negotiation he recognized because he'd done it himself 10,000 times across tables and in rooms where the wrong word cost more than money. "It's routine," she said. "They want to confirm the Vanessa." She went quiet. "I've had 3 conversations in the past week," he said, his voice staying level, with considerable effort, that were all variations on the same theme. "The first was with my attorney, who told me you've been calling his office asking questions about the estate structure. The second was with a journalist. Someone contacted a journalist, a specific one who covers a specific kind of story. And that journalist called my communications director asking for comment on whether there was a child involved in the Devereaux divorce situation. The third was with a woman named Della Park, who apparently works for you in some capacity, who was overheard at a restaurant telling someone that the Devereaux heir situation was complicated." He paused. "Would you like to tell me about the tests?" Her chin came up. The performance shifted, recalibrated. "I don't know what Della said or why she said it. I can't be responsible for Vanessa." His voice didn't rise. That was the thing about the voice Lucien Devereaux used when things were serious. It didn't rise, it dropped, it got quieter, and everyone who knew him understood that the quiet was the danger. "I'm going to ask you directly, is the pregnancy genuine, and is the child mine?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. He counted them. "Of course it is," she said. "I want documentation," he said. "Independent testing, doctor of my choosing, full blood work, arranged by the end of this week." Her mouth opened, closed. Something in the careful architecture of her expression began to deteriorate. "You're asking me to prove, after everything I've given up, after everything you're asking me to prove?" "Yes," he said. "I am." He walked away. Behind him, he heard her make a sound that was almost a word, swallowed, at the last second. Her heels on the marble corridor were sharp and fast, moving in the opposite direction, and he tracked the sound until it disappeared around a corner. He stood still for a moment after that, in the corridor with its expensive art and its imported stone, and he thought about what her face had done in that 4-second silence. He'd spent 20 years reading people's faces across negotiating tables, and what he'd seen in those 4 seconds wasn't the outrage of an innocent person accused. It was the recalculation of someone running options. He'd known con artists before. In his world, they were called something else, but the mechanism was the same. The meeting with the other families happened on a Thursday evening in a restaurant in Lower Manhattan that had been closed to the public and swept twice for surveillance equipment. Lucian arrived last, intentionally, the way he'd always arrived last to these things, letting the absence build its own pressure. He noted the expressions as he moved to the head of the table. Carlucci with his manufactured neutrality, Ferrano watching him like a man watching a structure to see if it's going to hold, Bianchi with his hands folded and his eyes performing respect while calculating something behind them. Ochoa simply watched him sit down with the direct, unadorned assessment of a man who'd already decided something. Lucian opened without preamble. I know what you're all doing. I know the conversations you've been having and the moves you're each making or considering. I'm not here to threaten anyone. He paused. I'm here because we've operated inside a set of agreements for over a decade that have benefited every person at this table, and those agreements are based on a logic that still holds whether or not you believe it does. Carlucci leaned forward slightly. He was 62, built like furniture, with eyes that had seen enough to not bother expressing surprise anymore. The logic held, he said, because the math held. The math has changed. The math has had a disruption, Lucian said. A disruption. Carlucci let the words sit there. 7 years ago, your people came to my operation and made it very clear that disruptions were not acceptable. You remember what happened to Velasco in 2019 when his operation had a disruption? The table was quiet. I remember, Lucian said. Then you understand, Carlucci said, that what you're asking us to do is extend a credit to someone who, by the standards you yourself established, shouldn't be extended credit. Ferrano, younger, more precise, the kind of man who'd gone to business school and then gone into the family business and was never quite comfortable in either world, spread his hands on the table in a gesture of reluctant reason. Nobody wants a war, Lucian. A war is expensive and it's bad for everyone. What people want is certainty. They want to know that the arrangements they have are built on something solid. Right now, the feeling is that they might not be. Give us something solid, Ochoa said. He was the plainest speaker at the table by a considerable distance. Not words. Something we can put weight on. Lucian looked at each face in turn. He'd been in rooms like this before, rooms where the balance was shifting and everyone was waiting to see who moved first, and he'd always known what to say, had always had the precise combination of threat and reassurance and demonstrated capability that reset the equilibrium. He reached for that now. But what he reached for wasn't entirely there. Because the thing he kept circling back to, in the back of his mind where the machinery ran underneath the performance, was Garza's assessment. The thing Evelyn had built, the financial architecture, the political relationships that ran through the legitimate businesses, the credibility in rooms where violence was not the primary language. That was what had made him unpredictable in a way that was more dangerous than guns. The ability to operate in both worlds simultaneously, to be present in a city councilman's office and a shipping warehouse on the same afternoon with equal fluency. He was only fully fluent in one of those languages. He'd always known that, in the way you know things about yourself that you prefer not to examine. He said what needed to be said at the table. He made the commitments and the implicit warnings that the room required. He watched faces recalculate and settle into temporary positions. The meeting ended with handshakes that meant various things. Walking to his car afterward, Garza at his shoulder, he felt something he hadn't expected. Tired. Not the operational exhaustion of a difficult day, but something deeper. A tiredness that had been accumulating in layers for longer than he'd acknowledged. How much runway do we have? He asked Garza. Garza didn't ask him to clarify what he meant. The legitimate operations that are still inside our structure. 18 months, maybe 24 if we're careful. After that, the revenue gap is structural, not situational. And the other side of the business. The other side is stable, Garza said. But you've spent 12 years using the legitimate side to insulate the other side from certain kinds of pressure. Without that insulation, you have a different kind of exposure. They got to the car. Lucian stood with his hand on the door for a moment, looking at the lower Manhattan skyline, the lights refracting off water somewhere in the middle distance. She built a wall around us, he said. It wasn't really directed at Garza. Garza said nothing because there wasn't anything useful to say. And I didn't even know it was there, Lucian said, because I was inside it. He got in the car. It was 11 days after that meeting when Harwick called. Lucian was going through supply chain documentation that required his signature, a task he'd always delegated, now sitting at his desk himself because delegation required trust, and trust had a new texture lately. His phone was face down on the desk, and he almost let it go to voicemail. Something made him answer. "I need to speak with you directly," Harwick said. "Not a report, in person." "How soon?" "Tonight, if you can." They met at a bar in the West Village that Harwick chose, a quiet place with bad lighting and good acoustics for private conversation. Harwick was already there, a glass of water in front of him, the expression on his face carefully arranged around something uncomfortable. He was ex-intelligence, which meant he'd delivered bad news to rooms that shot the messenger, and he had the particular composure that practice gave you. "What is it?" Lucian said. Not a question. Harwick put a manila envelope on the table. "I closed the Evelyn file. I told you that." He paused. "But this isn't from the Evelyn file." Lucian looked at the envelope. Didn't pick it up yet. "Then what file is it from?" "Vanessa Romano," Harwick said. "You didn't ask me to look at her, but when I closed the Evelyn file, there was a thread. I followed it because that's what I do." He paused again. "I'm not charging you for this one." When someone with Harwick's billing rates tells you he's not charging for something, it means he believes you needed to know, regardless of whether you'd have paid to find out. Lucian opened the envelope. The documents inside were medical in nature. Clinic records, not from the prenatal practice Vanessa had been attending, but from a separate facility. They were accompanied by a timeline Harwick had compiled and 3 photographs of Vanessa meeting with a man Lucian didn't recognize in a coffee shop in Midtown, on 3 separate dates, over a 2-month period. "Who is he?" Lucian said. "His name is Marcus Webb. He works in finance. He and Vanessa Romano have been," Harwick chose the word carefully, "connected for approximately 8 months. Lucian set the documents down and looked at the photographs. Vanessa and the man called Marcus Webb in a coffee shop, leaning across a small table, talking in the manner of people who are comfortable with each other in a way that takes time to develop. In the 3rd photograph, they were laughing. "The medical records," Lucian said. "The pregnancy is real," Harwick said. "She hasn't lied about that. But the records from that facility, the timeline doesn't hold for the paternity claim." The bar was quiet around them. Someone at the far end was watching a game on a screen mounted above the bottles, and the sound was low, crowd noise filtering through bad speakers. "By how much?" Lucian said. "By enough," Harwick said. "I'm not a physician. I had someone look at it. They were unambiguous." Lucian sat with this information. He sat with it the way you sit with something structural, something that doesn't just change a fact but changes the architecture of the past several months, makes you look back at every conversation and every expression and every carefully arranged entrance into a corridor and see it differently. All of it. The strategic positioning, the questions about the estate, the journalist, the 4-second silence. "She needed my name," he said. "Yes," Harwick said. "For the child." "Yes. And she thought the situation with Evelyn made me vulnerable enough that I wouldn't look too hard." Harwick said nothing. Lucian looked at the photograph of Vanessa and Marcus Webb laughing in a coffee shop. He thought about how she'd looked standing in that hospital lobby, beautiful, composed, smelling expensive, and about how he'd thought in some compartmentalized part of himself, even in that worst moment, that she was the kind of woman who made a man feel powerful. He'd built an empire on his ability to see through people. He'd made men confess things they'd intended never to reveal. He'd sat across tables from individuals who were lying with total commitment and identified the lie in the time it took them to blink. He had not seen Vanessa Romano clearly, not once. "Where is she tonight?" he said. "The apartment on Park," Harwick said. "She's been there since this afternoon." Lucian put the photographs back in the envelope. He put the envelope inside his jacket. He put $30 on the table and stood up. "Lucian," Harwick said. He stopped. "Don't do anything that adds to the problem," Harwick said. Lucian looked at him for a moment. "I'm going to have a conversation," he said. "That's all." He walked out into the night air, the city loud and indifferent around him, and he thought about all the things he'd lost in the past 41 days. Not the money, not the territory, not the respectful silence that used to greet his name in certain rooms, but something more specific and harder to name, some version of himself that had believed, without examining the belief, that he was the center of everything, that the empire ran because of him, that Evelyn stood beside him because he was worth standing beside, that Vanessa wanted him because he was worth wanting. He'd been wrong about all three. He stood outside the building on Park Avenue, looking up at the lit windows of the apartment he'd furnished and paid for, and he thought about Evelyn's face in the elevator, the smile, the peace, the absolute absence of the anger he would have been able to understand and respond to. And he thought about what it meant that she'd built escape hatches into a marriage she'd entered with hope, because she'd known, at some cellular level, what kind of man he was. He went inside. The conversation with Vanessa lasted 11 minutes. He set the medical documents on her kitchen counter without speaking. He watched her read them, watched her face do what faces do when a strategy collapses and there's no prepared position to retreat to. She started to speak twice and stopped both times. The third attempt produced something that was trying to be an explanation and couldn't sustain its own structure. "Don't," he said. She looked at him. "Just don't." He walked back to the door. He stopped with his hand on the knob because something in him needed to say one thing, needed to close something properly even in the wreckage of it. "You wanted an empire," he said, without turning around. "You looked at what I had and you decided that was worth having. I understand that. I've taken things that weren't mine too." He paused. "But you chose the wrong moment. The empire you wanted is already gone." He opened the door. "And the woman who built it is somewhere out there building something better." He walked out. The hallway was empty. The elevator was empty. The lobby was empty. He walked through the revolving door into the cold New York night and stood on the sidewalk and understood with complete and shattering clarity that he was, for the first time in 20 years, entirely alone. No Evelyn, no Vanessa. The empire cracking under the pressure of its missing architecture. The family circling. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A number he didn't recognize. A text message with 4 words and an attachment that finished loading as he stood there on the sidewalk. The 4 words were, "You should see this." The attachment was a photograph. Lucian stared at it for a long time. In the photograph, standing outside a building he didn't recognize in a city he couldn't immediately place, was Evelyn. She was wearing a coat, her hair longer than he remembered, and she was laughing at something someone beside her had said. She looked healthy. She looked, in a way that was almost painful to look at directly, free. But it was the detail beside her that stopped his breathing completely. A child's hand, small, reaching up to hold hers. The child's face cut off by the frame, but the hand was there, undeniable, and the height of it and the angle of it against hers indicated a child perhaps 4 or 5 years old. Lucian did the math. He stood on the sidewalk doing the math, and when he finished doing it, he stood very still while the city moved around him, and something in the architecture of everything he'd understood about the past 5 years began to collapse and rebuild simultaneously into a shape he wasn't ready for. The phone buzzed again. She didn't leave empty, Lucian. He looked up at the city. His city, except it had never entirely been his, had it. He'd been standing at the center of something he'd only partially built, protected by walls he hadn't known were there, and now the walls were gone, and the woman who'd built them was somewhere in a photograph he'd been sent by someone who wanted him to know. He didn't know yet what the knowledge would cost him, but he understood, standing there with the cold working through his jacket and the sound of the city indifferent around him, that there was no version of what came next that didn't require him to become someone he had no practice being. The man who didn't know how to protect the things that mattered was about to find out if it was too late to learn. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the back of his car for 2 hours after leaving Park Avenue, the photograph still open on his phone, the city sliding past the tinted windows like something that belonged to someone else. His driver, a man named Teo, who'd been with him for 9 years and understood that certain silences required absolute preservation, took the long route home without being asked. Across the bridge, down through streets that were emptying out in the cold, past neighborhoods that had changed and neighborhoods that hadn't, and a diner on a corner that Lucian had eaten at exactly once, in 1998, when he was nobody and everything still felt like it was accelerating towards something worth having. He stared at the photograph. The child's hand, small. The fingers slightly blurred at the edge of the frame, caught in motion, reaching upward the way small children reach for things they trust will be there. The angle put the child at approximately 4 years old, maybe 4.5. He kept doing the arithmetic, and the arithmetic kept landing in the same place. And every time it landed there, something in his chest did something he didn't have language for. He had people who could trace a photo's metadata. He had people who could identify a building from its facade, cross-reference architectural permits, narrow a geographic location to a city block given enough resolution. He had resources that made finding things possible. He also knew from Harwick that Evelyn had left traces precisely where she wanted them and nowhere else. That was not the profile of someone who would let a photograph containing her location circulate carelessly, which meant the photograph had been sent deliberately, which meant someone wanted him to know and wanted him to think about what knowing would do to him, and had calculated that this specific information delivered in this specific moment, alone on a sidewalk after the Vanessa situation collapsed, would hit with maximum force. Someone who understood how he thought. Someone who'd had years of proximity to the way his mind worked. The number that had sent it was dead by the time he had Garza run it the next morning. A burner, activated, used once, deactivated. No cell tower data that resolved to anything useful. The photograph's metadata had been scrubbed professionally. Harwick, Garza said. No, Lucien said. He was certain of this. Harwick doesn't play both sides. It's not how he's built. Then who knew enough about the situation to... Someone in this house, Lucien said. Or someone who used to be. The silence in the office shifted texture. Garza stood very still. He was a careful man, Garza, had always been a careful man, and he chose his next words with the deliberateness of someone navigating a floor that might not hold. You're saying there's an internal leak. I'm saying someone sent me a photograph of Evelyn and a child from a burner phone the same night I confronted Vanessa. The timing is not coincidental. Lucien looked at him. Who knew where I was going last night? You, me, Harwick, and Teo. And who knew the content of the Harwick report before I did? Garza's jaw tightened. I reviewed the initial materials when Harwick submitted them for courier. That's protocol. Who else touched that courier? Standard handling, 2 people in the secure documents room. Garza paused. Lucien, I've been with this family for... I know how long you've been here. Lucien's voice stayed level, but something underneath it was not level, and Garza heard it and went quiet. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm mapping the information flow. That's what we do when we don't know where the breach is. Garza nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man who understands that the rules apply to everyone and is deciding whether to resent that or respect it. Put together the list, Lucien said. Everyone who had access to any information about Evelyn's search, Vanessa's documentation, or my movements in the past 72 hours. Everyone. I don't care about tenure. The list came back with 11 names. He spent 3 days moving through those 11 names the way you move through a building you suspect is wired, carefully, without announcing yourself, testing weight before committing. He had quiet conversations. He watched eyes. He asked questions about unrelated things and noted the quality of the answers, the micro delays, the places where someone's body language said something their mouth didn't. On the 3rd day, the Empire made the decision for him. The call came at 6:40 in the morning, Garza's number, and Lucien was already awake because he was always awake at 6:40 now, sitting at the desk in his study, going through financial structures that someone with Evelyn's facility with numbers would have been able to navigate in an afternoon and that were taking him weeks. The Rotterdam shipment, Garza said. Lucien set down his coffee. What about it? It didn't arrive. A beat. Define didn't arrive. The vessel docked. The container was not on it. The manifest shows it was loaded in Rotterdam. It was not in the container when the container was opened in Newark. Garza's voice was doing the thing it did when the news was bad enough that he was working to keep it clinical. That's 14 million in product, Lucien. Gone. That's not a logistical failure, Lucien said. No, Garza said. It's not. Someone had known the shipment schedule. Someone had known the container number, the vessel, the Newark dock location, and the specific window when the container would be accessible without the kind of attention that made removal complicated. That was operational information held by fewer than 6 people. Get me those 6 people, Lucien said. Today. Same room. He drove to the warehouse in Red Hook himself, which he hadn't done in years. The Don arriving personally at a working location, without announcement, the car pulling up to a loading bay that wasn't expecting him. He noted the expression on the dock supervisor's face when he walked in, and noted specifically that the dock supervisor's surprise looked genuine. He filed that. The 6 people were in a windowless room by noon. Lucian stood. They sat. The room smelled like damp concrete and engine oil, and the specific tension of people who don't know precisely why they've been called together, but understand that whatever it is, it's serious. He looked at them for a long moment without speaking. He'd learned this from a man he'd watched operate when he was 22. A man who'd understood that silence before an accusation was more destabilizing than the accusation itself, because it let each person in the room begin to inventory their own conscience unprompted. "One of you," he said, "or someone talking to someone in this room, moved a $14 million shipment out of a container before it hit Newark. I want to explain what happens next. I'm going to ask each of you a single question. The question is going to be, do you know anything about this? If you say no and you're telling the truth, you walk out of here the same as you came in. If you say no and you're lying, I'll find out, and the conversation we have after that will be different." He paused. "If you say yes, or if you tell me something useful, we'll have a different conversation of a different kind. Understood?" He went around the room. 5 NOs, each with the texture of people genuinely trying to communicate their innocence, the specific anxious quality of the truthful person wrongly present at a bad situation. The 6th person was a logistics coordinator named Price, 34, with the Devereaux operation for 3 years, recruited out of a legitimate freight company by a mid-level associate who'd since retired. Price said no, but what his eyes did in the half-second before his mouth opened was not the same as what the other's eyes had done. Lucian noted this and moved on without changing his expression, without indicating that Price's no had landed differently. He thanked the room. He let them file out. He asked Price, as an apparent afterthought, to stay behind for a scheduling question. Price stayed. The door closed. The conversation lasted 22 minutes. By the 14th minute, Price was sweating through his collar and had stopped making eye contact. And by the 19th minute, the structure of what had happened began to emerge from the wreckage of his maintained denials, in the way that structures always emerged from Lucian's interrogations. Not through force, but through the relentless closing of every exit until the only door left led to the truth. The shipment had been redirected. Price had provided container numbers and scheduling windows to a contact he described as someone from Carlucci's organization. For money he'd been paid in 3 installments over 6 weeks beginning before the Rotterdam arrangement had even been finalized, which meant Price had been placed inside Lucian's operation as an asset before this specific situation. His value had been general access, and the Rotterdam shipment had simply been the moment they cashed him in. "How long?" Lucian said. 3 years, Price said. His voice had gone to something thin and structural, like a material tested past its limits. "I've been with them 3 years. 3 years. The same tenure as his employment with the Devereaux operation. The man had been placed from the beginning, a sleeper asset in logistics, in the specific department with access to container-level specifics of the import operation." "What else did you give them?" Lucian said. Price closed his eyes. "Everything," he said. "Everything I could access." Lucian stood very still. 3 years of logistics intelligence fed to Carlucci's organization. 3 years of container numbers, scheduling windows, supplier relationships, shipping routes, and whatever operational intelligence touched the freight side of the business. Carlucci hadn't started making moves after Evelyn left. Carlucci had been building the case for those moves for 3 years, waiting for a moment of instability, preparing for exactly this kind of controlled demolition. The Brooklyn confrontation, the $14 million container, the family circling, all of it coordinated with foreknowledge of Lucian's operational specifics. He had been systematically undermined for 3 years from inside his own structure. He walked out of that room with the particular controlled steadiness of a man holding something very hot and absolutely unable to drop it in public. He told Garza what Price had said. He watched Garza's face move through the information and settle into something grim and exhausted. "How many more?" Garza said. "I don't know," Lucian said. "If Carlucci placed one, he could have placed—" "I know." They looked at each other. "The internal list," Lucian said. "The 11 names from the information flow mapping. You think Price is on it. Price had access to everything Harwick submitted to this office. He was in the document handling chain. He could have photographed those files. He could have sourced the Evelyn image, not taken it himself but passed it to Carlucci's people, who would have their own resources. He stopped. The photograph wasn't meant to tell me where Evelyn was. It was meant to destabilize me at the moment I was already destabilized, to knock my focus further off, to get me spending my time and attention chasing a ghost instead of looking at what was happening inside my own walls. Garza said nothing for a moment. Did it work? Lucian thought about the 3 days he'd spent on the 11-name list. The conversations, the observation, the careful movement through the building looking for something internal while an external operation dismantled him from outside. Yes, he said. For 3 days, it worked. He had Carlucci's number. They'd exchanged numbers years ago, in the way people at that level of the business exchanged numbers, for emergencies, for the kind of communication that needed to happen quickly without layers of intermediary. He'd never used it. He'd never needed to. Carlucci had always operated in the understood awareness that needing to call Lucian Devereaux directly meant you were already in trouble. He called it now. Carlucci answered on the second ring, which told Lucian the call was expected. "You placed a man in my logistics department," Lucian said. A pause that was not a pause of surprise. That's a very specific accusation. "I'm not accusing. I'm informing you that I know. I'm also informing you that what comes next between us depends on the next 3 minutes of conversation, so I'd suggest we skip the performance." Carlucci's voice, when he answered, had dropped the social texture it usually carried. What remained was the operational man underneath, stripped back to pure calculation. "What do you want to talk about?" "I want to know what this is," Lucian said. "Is this a takeover play, or is this an opportunity play?" Another pause. "What's the difference? Takeover. You want what I have, and you're willing to do what it takes to get it. Opportunity, you saw weakness and moved because that's what you do. But there's a ceiling on how far you want to push it." He kept his voice even. "Those are two different conversations." Silence on the line. Lucian waited, because he'd always known how to wait. It was one of the few things he knew with total confidence about himself. "There's a third option," Carlucci said finally. "Tell me." The families have been talking. Not just me, all of us. And the conversation isn't about what we want from you. It's about what we want from the space your operation used to occupy. Carlucci let that sit. "You understand what I mean by that." Lucian understood exactly what he meant. The space. Not his money, not his territory, not his soldiers or his political contacts or his reputation. The structural position in the city's underground economy that the Devereaux operation had occupied, the specific niche of a large, stable, insulated organization that could maintain relationships between factions, that could operate at the intersection of legitimate and criminal economy in ways that benefited everyone through the financial architecture Evelyn had built. Without Evelyn, that architecture was gone. And without that architecture, the space wasn't Lucian's space anymore. It was just space, and in their world, space didn't stay empty. "You're not trying to take from me," Lucian said slowly. "You're moving into what I can no longer hold." "We gave it more time than most would have," Carlucci said. 2 months. We waited 2 months to see if the operation would stabilize. And when it didn't, we adapted. Lucian stood in the corridor of the Red Hook warehouse, the smell of engine oil still on him, the weight of 3 years of deliberately placed treachery somewhere in the vicinity of his chest. He thought about the meeting at the restaurant, the handshakes that meant various things. He thought about Ferrano's hands spread flat on the table, the gesture of reluctant reason that had been, he now understood, performed reason, designed to buy time for something already in motion. He thought about $14 million in a container somewhere that was no longer his. What would it take, he said, to stop this? Carlucci's response was immediate, which meant it had been prepared. A seat. Explain. At the table. A permanent seat with actual weight. Not the ceremonial respect you've been allowing us. Real participation in decisions that affect the city's operations. A pause. The structure you built. The political access, the financial buffer. That's gone. We understand that. We're not asking for what you had. We're asking for recognition of what the balance of power currently is. Lucian closed his eyes for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, he saw the table at the restaurant, the faces around it. He saw himself at the head of that table in his mind, the unchallenged center, and then he saw what the table actually looked like now, the weight distribution of it, and understood that sitting at the head of a table where no one acknowledged your primacy was not sitting at the head of a table. It was standing in a room performing a title that had lost its referent. "I'll need time to consider the terms," he said. "You have 72 hours, Carlucci said. After that, the conversation we'd be having would be about something different." He paused, and there was in the pause the weight of a man who knows exactly what he holds. "I don't want to have that conversation, Lucian. You know that." The line went dead. Lucian lowered the phone. Around him, the warehouse continued its function. A forklift moving somewhere in the middle distance. The sound of a hydraulic door. Voices speaking the flat, efficient language of men doing physical work. Normal industrial sound, indifferent to the empire dying quietly inside it. He drove back to the mansion. He sat at Evelyn's piano. He didn't touch the keys. He didn't play, had never played. Music wasn't a language he spoke, but he sat on the bench and put his hands flat on the lid above the keys and felt the lacquered surface, cool and slightly dusty from the months nobody had touched it. And he stayed there for a long time. He thought about Carlucci saying the space your operation used to occupy, and about how precisely true that was, and about how the operation had occupied that space not because of him, but because of what Evelyn had built in the margins of his reign while he was busy believing he was the whole story. He thought about a man named Price who'd been placed inside his structure 3 years ago and had fed intelligence outward for the entire duration of his employment, and about how he'd brought Price in through a mid-level associate who'd since retired, and about how retirement in his world didn't necessarily mean departure, and about how many threads there might be that he'd been walking past for years without seeing because he'd been inside the walls, and the walls had felt permanent. He thought about a photograph of a child's hand reaching upward in trust. He opened his laptop and accessed the financial records himself, not through Garza, not through the accounting department, but directly, using credentials that only he and one other person had ever held. He pulled 12 months of the legitimate operations cash flow. He pulled the structure maps of the holdings Evelyn had transferred. He pulled the architectural blueprints of what she'd built, insofar as those existed in recorded form. He sat with those documents until 2 in the morning. What he found, spread across the spreadsheets and holding structures and financial maps of the operation he'd believed he understood, was the ghost of another mind. Decisions made years ago that had seemed, at the time, like conservative financial management, and that he now understood to be structural load-bearing choices, invisible from inside the system because they were the system's foundation. Relationships with city officials maintained through charitable giving that had created goodwill in regulatory environments. The criminal side of the business depended on without knowing it. Financial buffers built into the legitimate operations that had absorbed shocks that would otherwise have exposed the entire structure to collapse. She hadn't just built a business inside his empire. She'd built the empire's immune system. And she'd done it quietly, without credit, without any of the recognition that men in his world gave and withheld as currency, because she hadn't built it for recognition. She'd built it because she understood what the empire actually needed, and she was the only one paying attention closely enough to provide it. He sat at the desk until the first gray light came through the window, and he felt, with a completeness that he hadn't felt for anything in 20 years, the full weight of what he'd done. Not the infidelity, which was its own category of damage, not the power he'd lost, but the specific act of walking past a person who was building something extraordinary and choosing, day after day, not to see it, because seeing it would have required acknowledging that he was not the only thing keeping them alive. His phone buzzed at 7:15. Garza. A text, 4 words. "We have a problem." He called back immediately. Garza's voice was different from all the previous different versions of Garza's voice. This one had something underneath it that Lucian identified after a half-second as fear, and Garza did not fear things easily. "The Attorney General's office," Garza said. "There's a sealed indictment. Lucian, they've had a sealed indictment for 3 months. Someone gave them enough to... It's not everything, but it's enough. The financial structures they're citing, these are the structures that were still inside our control, the ones that didn't transfer. Someone walked them through the architecture." Lucian's hand was very still on the phone. "Someone who understood the architecture," he said. Someone who understood it from the inside, Garza said. The level of detail in what the AG's office apparently has, this isn't a wiretap. This isn't surveillance. Someone sat down with the prosecutor and explained how the structures worked. The room was very quiet. Lucian thought about Price, but Price had been logistics, not finance. Price had known shipment schedules and container numbers, not financial architecture. The architecture required someone else. Someone with years of proximity to the specific way the legitimate and criminal structures interfaced. Someone who understood both sides of the wall well enough to explain the wall to a federal prosecutor. He thought about the 11 names. He'd been working through them looking for who had sent the photograph, and he hadn't finished, and now the question had changed, widened, become larger and more dangerous than a single photograph from a burner phone. Pull everyone, he said. Now. Anyone with financial access, I want them accounted for. I want to know where every one of those 11 people is this morning. A pause that lasted 1 second too long. Garza, he said. I'm pulling the list, Garza said. Hold on. Keyboards, the sound of Garza moving through the office, a door, voices at a distance. Then Garza's footsteps coming back, and his voice, and the quality of the silence before he spoke told Lucian what was coming before it arrived. 8 of 11 are accounted for, Garza said. 2 are reachable by phone, not in the building. He stopped. 1 I can't locate. Phone is off. The building contact number routes to voicemail. Home address. I sent someone 30 minutes ago. The apartment has been vacated. Who? Lucian said. Garza said the name. Lucian sat with it. The name was someone who'd been with the family for 6 years. Someone who handled the interface between the legitimate and criminal financial structures specifically, who had deep access to the architecture on both sides of the wall, who had been in the room for more sensitive financial conversations than Lucian could immediately count. Someone he had considered, without ever saying so explicitly, part of the inner circle, one of the people the operation couldn't function without. Someone who had, apparently, at some point in the past year, made a different calculation. And someone who had, he now understood, known enough about Evelyn's search, about Harwick's file, about the ongoing investigation to locate her, to have been the source of the photograph. Not from proximity to the Vanessa situation or from the burner phone, but from access to the files, from the ability to source an image of Evelyn from surveillance or secondary contacts, from the knowledge of exactly what moment would hit hardest. Someone who'd wanted him looking in one direction while the indictment was sitting sealed in a federal building 3 miles away. He stood up from the desk. He walked to the window. Outside, the grounds were quiet in the early morning light. The security team doing their rotations, everything looking from a distance exactly like it always had. The same trees, the same iron fence, the same careful management of appearance that had surrounded him for 20 years. From outside, it still looked like the seat of something powerful. From inside, it was a building with its foundations removed, its load-bearing structures quietly emptied out, its immune system gone, its financial insulation stripped, and now a sealed indictment waiting in a federal building with someone's name on it who understood the architecture well enough to explain it to a prosecutor. His phone rang. Unknown number. Not a burner this time. This one resolved when he let it go to voicemail and had it traced in the following hour to a law office in Washington, D.C. The voicemail contained 38 seconds of a voice he didn't recognize, calm and professional, which told him that the Attorney General's office was prepared to discuss cooperation under certain parameters, and that the window for that discussion was limited, and that given the nature and extent of the sealed materials, the parameters available to him today would not be available to him in 72 hours. 72 hours. The same window Carlucci had given him. He stood at the window looking at the grounds that still looked like power from a distance, and he understood that the 2 clocks were not coincidental. They were coordinated. Carlucci on one side and a federal prosecutor on the other, both counting down from the same number. And somewhere between those 2 countdowns was a man who'd vanished from an apartment and taken with him the specific knowledge required to explain the architecture of everything Lucian had built over 20 years. And somewhere beyond all of it, in a city he hadn't identified yet, a woman was building something better. He had 72 hours. The empire he'd spent 20 years constructing was being demolished with tools his own people had provided, by forces that had been preparing this specific moment with operational patience that rivaled anything he'd ever deployed against someone else. And the only question left, the one that would determine whether anything survived, Whether there was anything worth saving, whether the man standing at the window was capable of becoming something other than what he'd always been, was whether Lucien Devereaux could do the one thing he had absolutely no practice doing. Ask for help from the only person who had ever truly understood how the whole thing worked, and whom he had absolutely no right to ask anything of, ever again. He made the call at 8:47 in the morning, not to Carlucci, not to the Washington law office, not to Harwick or Garza or any of the remaining infrastructure of an empire that was bleeding out from a dozen wounds simultaneously. He called Evelyn's sister. Her name was Clara Ashford, and she lived in a brownstone in Philadelphia that Lucien had visited exactly twice during the marriage, both times early, both times when he and Evelyn were still the kind of people who visited family together. Clara had never liked him. She'd been precise about it in the way educated women are precise about dislike. Not hostile, not dramatic, just consistently, unmistakably clear in her assessment. She'd shaken his hand at the wedding with the expression of someone signing a document they have reservations about. She answered on the fourth ring. "I know who this is," she said. Her voice was flat and awake, no sleep in it, which meant either she'd been up or she'd been expecting this. "You have 40 seconds. I need to reach Evelyn," he said. "No." "Clara." "I said no. That's the whole answer. There's no version of this conversation where I help you find my sister. I'm not trying to find her." He stopped, because that wasn't precisely true. And Clara would hear the imprecision the way Evelyn would have heard it, the same calibration, the same refusal to accept approximations. He started again. "There are federal proceedings. They involve the financial structures, the structures Evelyn built. Her name may be on documentation that prosecutors have. I don't know the full scope of what they have yet, but the architecture of those businesses, the way she built them, the interface between legitimate and—" "Stop!" Claire's voice sharpened. "Are you telling me she's in legal exposure? I'm telling you I don't know the scope of what the AG's office is working with, and neither does she. And she needs counsel who understands the full picture before federal investigators decide to reach out to her directly. Which they will." He kept his voice level, informational. The voice of a man delivering data, not making a plea, because Clara would respond to data and close against pleas immediately. She built those structures. She knows them better than anyone. That makes her valuable to a prosecution and potentially exposed as a participant, depending on how they characterize the interface between. She transferred everything out. She transferred ownership, the history of those structures, the decisions made during the years they were operational, the financial relationships established. Those don't transfer with the paperwork. He paused. "I'm not calling to find her. I'm calling to make sure she has warning before someone else finds her first, and she's sitting across from a federal prosecutor without knowing the full picture." Silence. He heard Clara breathing, heard, beneath the breathing, the sound of something being weighed. "You have someone who can look at the exposure," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "I have someone who can map it, completely, without anything going back to the federal investigation." He paused. "She needs to know what she's potentially in. That's all I'm saying." "I'll pass it along," Clara said. "That's all I'll say." The line went dead. He stood with the phone in his hand for a moment. He didn't know if Clara would pass it along or file the call in the same place she'd filed her opinion of him since 2007. He didn't know if Evelyn, wherever she was, would make any decision in response that included engaging with him in any form. He'd done what he could do, which was provide accurate information through the only channel he had access to, and now the decision belonged to someone else, which was its own particular discomfort. He turned around and found Garza in the doorway of the study. "The situation's moving," Garza said. He meant Carlucci. It was 9:15 when the first report came in from the Brooklyn operation. 3 of Lucien's distribution points hit simultaneously, which wasn't coincidence and wasn't improvised. Coordinated, timed to land before the business day was fully operational, in locations that were chosen for symbolic value as much as tactical value. Carlucci was sending a message about the 72-hour window. He was demonstrating that the clock was real. Lucien had 8 men at those 3 locations. He'd had more 2 months ago. The math of the past few weeks had expressed itself in the departure of people who read the shifting weight distribution and made individual calculations about where to be when the structure finally went. "Don't respond," Lucien said. Garza stared at him. "They just hit 3. I know what they hit. Don't respond." He was already moving toward his jacket. Get me a car. Not the regular driver. One of the security team. Someone who hasn't been in the rotation. Where are you going? To have a conversation I should have had 3 weeks ago. He meant Ferrano. Of the families at that table in the restaurant, Ferrano was the one who'd spent time in both worlds in the way Lucian had tried and failed to sustain. The business school and the family business. He understood the intersection of legitimate and criminal economy not as a cover story, but as a genuine operational philosophy, and that understanding made him distinct from Carlucci, who was purely operational, purely the old grammar of violence and territory. Ferrano's office was in a building in Midtown that was genuinely, entirely legitimate, a real estate development company with a real portfolio and real employees who had no idea about the other side of the founder's professional life. Lucian walked in without an appointment, which was the kind of move that either worked immediately or created an incident, and he was banking on Ferrano's intelligence being sufficient to see the value in the meeting. He waited in a lobby for 4 minutes before a young woman came and escorted him to a conference room on the 31st floor with a view that cost more than most of Lucian's warehouses. Ferrano arrived 2 minutes later. He was wearing a suit that fit correctly in the way expensive suits do, and his expression, when he saw Lucian standing in his conference room, was thoughtful rather than surprised. He'd known, Lucian understood, that something like this was coming. "You want to sit down," Ferrano said. "I want to talk." Ferrano sat. Lucian stayed standing, because sitting would have implied equal footing, and the conversation he needed to have required him to position himself as someone making a specific offer from a specific place, not negotiating from equivalence. "Carlucci is going to move on the main operation within 72 hours, Lucian said. "You know this. You're part of the arrangement." Ferrano said nothing. "What you may not know," Lucian said, "is that the AG's office has a sealed indictment with financial specifics that came from inside my organization. The person who provided those specifics understood the structure well enough to explain the interface between legitimate and criminal operations in detail." He paused. "When that indictment unseals, the investigation doesn't stop at my operation. The AG's office is going to want the full network. Every family that has interfaced with my financial structures over the past decade is in that documentation somewhere." Ferrano's expression shifted, something tightening around the eyes. "I don't have proof of what you know and don't know about the indictment," Lucian said. "But I'm presenting you with the information as a professional courtesy, because you're the only person at that table who understands that a federal investigation that starts with me does not stay with me." Ferrano leaned back in his chair slowly. "What do you want?" "I want to know if the 72-hour arrangement can be restructured." "Carlucci's not going to—" "I'm not asking about Carlucci. I'm asking about you." Lucian looked at him directly. "You're the only one at that table who has something to lose from a federal investigation that spreads. Carlucci is insulated by 3 layers of intermediaries, and he knows it. You run a real company. You have real employees. You have a real portfolio that a federal investigation could freeze in an afternoon, and you know that too." The silence in the conference room was 31st floor silence, high and clean and thin. "What are you proposing?" Ferrano said. "I'm proposing that you use your weight at the table to extend the window. Not to protect me. You don't have any reason to protect me, and I'm not asking for that. To protect yourself. Because if Carlucci moves in 72 hours and I'm simultaneously hit with a federal indictment, the investigation that follows is going to be the largest organized crime case this city has seen in 20 years, and it's going to have subpoena authority over every organization that touched mine." Ferrano stood up. He walked to the window, which Lucian interpreted as a thinking posture rather than a deflection, and he stood looking at the city for a moment with his hands in his pockets. "How long do you need?" Ferrano said. 2 weeks. Ferrano turned around. "To do what?" "To make a deal with the AG that contains the investigation at my organization and doesn't expand outward. A cooperation agreement with specific documented scope limitations." He paused. "I built relationships with the federal system on the legitimate side for 12 years. I know what a scoped cooperation agreement looks like, and I know what prosecutors need to close a case versus what they'd want in an ideal world. I can give them what they need to close this without opening the wider network. And in exchange for this cooperation," Ferrano said carefully, "you would be exposing Myself, Lucian said. Primarily myself. The specific decisions I made, the specific operations I authorized. The structures, yes. The decision maker behind those structures, yes. He let that sit for a moment. Not the wider network. Not relationships that existed at the intersection of legitimate business and my organization. Those relationships were arm's length and can be documented as such. Ferrano studied him for a long time. You're describing the end of the Devereaux operation, he said. I'm describing a controlled end, Lucian said, versus an uncontrolled one. There's a difference. Another silence. A long one. The kind where real calculation was happening underneath the composed surface. I'll make calls, Ferrano said. I can't promise you 2 weeks. I can tell you I'll make calls. That's all I'm asking. He left the building and stood on the sidewalk and called Garza. Get me the Washington number, he said. The law office. Lucian, get me the number, Garza. He made the call from the back of the car on the way downtown. The attorney who answered was a woman named Reeves, precise and unsurprised. The voice of someone who spends her professional life in rooms where very powerful people have run out of other options. He told her he wanted a conversation about scope. She told him that kind of conversation required an in-person meeting and asked if he could be at a specific address in Lower Manhattan at 2 o'clock. He could. He arrived early and sat in the car outside and thought about what he was about to do. Not the legal mechanics of it. He'd been through enough of those to understand the broad architecture. But the human fact of it. 20 years. The thing he'd built, the name he'd made, the specific gravitational weight of being Lucian Devereaux in a city where that name meant something. All of it about to be placed on a table and negotiated into its component parts by people in suits who would use it to close a case file and then move on. He thought about Evelyn's piano. He thought about a child's hand reaching upward. He got out of the car and went inside. Reeves had 2 colleagues with her and a recording device that she asked permission to use, which he gave. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. He spoke for most of it. He answered questions that required him to describe, in specific and documented detail, the decisions he had made and the operations he had authorized over the course of 2 decades, and he answered them without deflection and without minimization. And the process had the texture of taking apart something you built with your hands, piece by piece, naming each piece as you set it down. At the end of the meeting, Reeves told him that what he'd described would require verification, that there were conditions and timelines that would need to be agreed upon, that the sealed indictment scope would need to be reviewed against what he'd provided today to determine what a cooperation agreement might look like. She told him to return tomorrow morning with counsel of his own. He walked out of the building at 4:42 in the afternoon. The city was doing what the city did in the late afternoon, moving, all of it moving. The sidewalks and the traffic and the specific low golden light that came off the Hudson in October and made Manhattan look from certain angles like something worth fighting for. His phone rang. He stopped walking. The number was one he didn't recognize, but the area code wasn't New York, and something in his body knew before his mind caught up with it. He answered. The silence on the line lasted 2 seconds. 2 seconds in which he stood absolutely still on a sidewalk in Lower Manhattan while the city moved around him and his heartbeat did something irregular and unpracticed. Then her voice. I spoke to Clara, Evelyn said. He closed his eyes. Her voice was the same. Lower, maybe. More settled in itself. The quality of someone who had found, on the far side of tremendous difficulty, a register that belonged entirely to them. Thank you for calling, he said. I'm not calling for you, she said, and the clarity of it wasn't cruel, just precise, the way she'd always been precise. I'm calling because Clara said there was a legal concern and I needed accurate information. That's all this is. I understand. Tell me the exposure. He told her. He was thorough and specific and did not editorialize and did not insert anything personal into the information because she had told him what this was, and he was going to respect that completely because it was the only thing he had to offer her that meant anything. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, there was a pause. My attorney has already been in contact with a federal liaison, she said. The legitimate business is transferred cleanly, and the documentation supports clean transfer. My exposure is limited. That's what I hope to hear, he said. Another pause. Longer. Are you cooperating? She said. Yes. Fully. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. That must have been a difficult decision. It was the only decision, he said. The line was quiet long enough that he thought she might have ended the call without speaking, the way she'd ended the marriage, quietly, without performance. But then she said something that he hadn't expected, in the voice that had gone lower and more settled, and it went into him like something physical. "The boy's name is Daniel," she said. He stopped breathing. "He's 5, she said. "He has your eyes and he builds things. He spends hours building things. He takes them apart and builds them differently." A pause. "I thought you should know his name." He had nothing to say. For the first time in 20 years, the man who had navigated every room and every table and every negotiation with the specific weaponized calm of someone who always knew his next move had nothing at all to say. "Evelyn," he said, just the name. It was all he had. "Cooperate fully," she said. "Do what you said you'd do. After that," she stopped. "After that, we'll see." The line went dead. He stood on the sidewalk for a long time. Around him, the city moved with complete indifference to what had just happened inside a phone call, which was that the man who'd ruled it for 20 years had just been given, for the first time, something genuinely worth rebuilding for. Daniel, 5 years old, building things and taking them apart and building them differently. His phone buzzed. Garza. A text. Ferrano called. "You have 10 days. Carlucci agreed to 10 days. Don't waste them. 10 days. He called Harwick. "I need you for something," he said. "Not a search. Something else." "What kind of something?" Harwick said. "The person who walked out of my organization with federal prosecutors' phone numbers already loaded. The one who vacated the apartment." He started walking again, moving through the city with purpose for the first time in weeks. "I need to find him before the federal investigators do. Not to silence him. I'm cooperating. His information is already theirs. But because there's a piece of this I need to understand before I sit down in that room tomorrow morning with my attorney, and that piece lives in whatever deal he made with the AG's office and what he told them about the wider network versus what I told them today." "You want to know if the stories match," Harwick said. "I want to know what he gave them that I haven't accounted for," Lucian said. "So I'm not sitting across from a prosecutor tomorrow while she's holding something I don't know she has." "Give me 4 hours," Harwick said. He went back to the mansion. He sat at his desk and he wrote, by hand, on paper, a complete accounting of every decision he could document, every operation he could specify, every financial structure he'd authorized. Not for the prosecutors. They'd get that in the formal process. For himself. Because he needed to know the full shape of what he was surrendering before he surrendered it, needed to hold the whole picture of it clearly, needed to face it directly rather than letting it exist as an abstraction managed by attorneys. He wrote for 3 hours. His hand hurt. He hadn't written this much by hand since he was young, before everything became phones and screens and intermediaries. The paper accumulated. The picture that emerged from it was not the picture of a triumphant empire. It was the picture of a system that had functioned because of overlapping mechanisms, only some of which he'd built. And that had been quietly failing for longer than the past few months, failing at its edges, fraying in the places where the legitimate and criminal structures had interfaced, sustaining itself on inertia and on the specific deterrent value of a name that had carried weight through reputation rather than through the ongoing demonstration of the capacity that had built the reputation. He was reading back through what he'd written when Harwick called. "He's in a hotel in Newark," Harwick said. "Room 412. He's been there 4 days. He hasn't left except for food from the lobby, which means he's either waiting for something or he's scared." "What's your read?" "Both," Harwick said. "He made a deal, but I don't think the deal feels as solid to him now as it did when he made it. People who cooperate with federal investigators often discover that the security they were promised is more conditional than advertised." "Is he alone?" "As of 2 hours ago, yes." Lucian put on his jacket. He thought about what Harwick had said in the bar in the West Village. Don't do anything that adds to the problem. He thought about what he'd told Reeves in the meeting room. Primarily myself. The specific decisions I made. He picked up his phone and called the Washington number. Reeves answered on the 3rd ring. "Tomorrow's meeting," he said. "I need you to know something before we begin. There's an individual currently in a hotel in Newark who I believe has provided information to your office. I'm going to speak with him tonight. I'm not going to harm him. I'm not going to ask him to recant or obstruct. I'm telling you I'm going to speak with him because I want to be transparent about my movements, and because I believe the conversation will help me provide you with a more complete picture tomorrow. A pause. Mr. Devereaux, I would strongly advise, I'm telling you, not asking permission, he said. I'll see you at 10. He drove to Newark. The hotel was the kind of place where the carpet had a pattern designed to hide stains and the hallways smelled like recycled air and old decisions. He found room 412 and knocked. A long silence, then movement inside. Who is it? Said the voice. You know who it is, Lucian said. Another silence. Longer. The door opened. The man standing in it had lost weight since Lucian had last seen him, which had been 3 weeks ago in a meeting that now read completely differently in retrospect. He was wearing the same shirt for at least 2 days by the look of it, and his eyes had the specific quality of someone who has been sitting alone with a decision for long enough to start questioning it. His name was Rice. He'd been with the organization for 6 years. He'd run the financial interface between the legitimate and criminal structures with a precision that Lucian had valued and trusted, and he understood now had failed to monitor with anything like the scrutiny that precision deserved. You're not going to... Rice started. I'm not going to do anything to you, Lucian said. I'm cooperating. Whatever you told them, they're going to hear from me tomorrow morning anyway. He looked at the man. I came because I want to understand something. He walked past Rice into the room without waiting to be invited. The room had the evidence of 4 days of confined anxiety. Takeout containers, a laptop with 17 browser tabs, a notepad covered in writing that Rice quickly moved to cover with his arm. When did you decide? Lucian said. He sat in the chair by the window, not the bed, not standing over him, just sitting, which was a choice about what kind of conversation this was going to be. Rice sat on the edge of the bed. He looked exhausted in the specific way of someone who's been running a dual existence and has finally stopped running. About a year ago, he said. Why? A long breath. Because I could see what was happening, before you could. He looked at Lucian, and there was something in his face that wasn't entirely guilt, something more complicated, almost defensive. The legitimate structures were the whole game, Lucian. Without them, the criminal side was just a target. When the legitimate structures started destabilizing, when Evelyn started moving, I could see where it was going to end, and I made a calculation. About your own position. About everyone's position. He stopped. Mostly mine. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Did you know about Price? Lucian said. Carlucci's man in logistics. Rice looked at him. No. He said it with a clarity that was specific and locatable. I didn't know about Price. But you knew Carlucci was moving. I knew someone was moving. The shipment irregularities from Rotterdam were too clean to be internal. I told you that in the... He stopped. You told me in the March operations review that the Rotterdam route needed tighter monitoring, Lucian said slowly. He remembered it. He'd noted it and moved on to other agenda items. And I didn't follow it up. No, Rice said. You didn't. The room was quiet. Lucian looked at this man who had sat in his organization for 6 years and built something that functioned well, and then watched it begin to fail, and made the calculation that an individual with inside knowledge was worth more to a federal prosecutor than an individual without it, and had made that calculation before the failure was complete, because Rice had always been a man who moved early. What did you tell them about the wider network? Lucian said. I told them about our organization, Rice said. The internal structures, the interface decisions, what I could document from my own position. I wasn't in a position to speak comprehensively about other organizations. What I knew about them was peripheral. Peripheral but present, Lucian said. Rice hesitated. Present, he admitted. So there's exposure for the wider network that isn't contained in what I provided today. Depending on how they use what I gave them, yes, potentially. Lucian sat with this. The 10-day window that Ferrano had negotiated, the cooperation agreement he was building, the specific scope limitations he'd tried to establish in the meeting with Reeves, all of that existed against the backdrop of Rice having provided a second set of documentation from a second vantage point, and the overlap between those two accounts was a shape he now needed to understand precisely before tomorrow morning. I need to know everything you told them, he said. Specifically, not the summary. Everything. I can't. Risa. His voice went flat. Not threatening, just final. The voice of a man who has run out of alternative positions. I'm sitting in a hotel room in Newark having a conversation that could be characterized in ways that would complicate my cooperation agreement because I needed to understand this before I walk into that room tomorrow. So you're going to tell me what you told them, and I'm going to sit here and listen, and then I'm going to go back to New York, and tomorrow morning I'm going to give them a complete picture that accounts for what you gave them, and we're both going to get through this. He paused. Or you cannot tell me, and tomorrow morning I walk in there without that knowledge, and whatever gaps exist become visible in the room, and everyone, including you, ends up in a worse position. Reese looked at him for a long moment. Then he started talking. It took 90 minutes. Lucian listened without writing, committing it to the same memory that had run the Empire, tracking the overlap and the gaps and the specific places where Rice's documentation intersected with what he'd provided today and the places where it extended beyond it. When Rice finished, the hotel room was very quiet. The Ferrano interface, Lucian said. Yes, Rice said. That's the piece that goes beyond your organization. How detailed? Detailed enough, Rice said. I have documentation of 3 specific transactions over 14 months that put Ferrano's legitimate entity in direct financial contact with operations that can't be characterized as arm's length. Lucian thought about the 31st floor conference room. Ferrano's hands in his pockets. The 10-day window he'd delivered. Ferrano didn't know Rice had documented those transactions. Ferrano had extended the 10-day window, believing he was exposed only to whatever Lucian knew, and Lucian had characterized the exposure as manageable. Ferrano had made a calculation based on incomplete information, which meant the 10-day window was built on a misunderstanding that would correct itself the moment the prosecutors compared Lucian's cooperation materials with Rice's, which meant the window was shorter than 10 days. He drove back to New York faster than he should have, the city's lights accumulating on the horizon as he crossed the bridge, his mind running the revised timeline with the same cold precision it had always run timelines. The precision that was, he understood now, the one thing genuinely his, the one capability that had not been built by someone else or maintained by someone else, or been dependent on structures he hadn't known he was standing inside. He could think. He could hold a complex situation in full resolution and identify the critical path through it. He called Garza from the car. The Ferrano timeline is wrong, he said. We have less than 10 days. Get me our attorney. Not the Cooperation Council, our attorney, tonight. I don't care what time it is. What happened? Garza said. The exposure is wider than Ferrano knows. When it surfaces, he's going to feel cornered, and a cornered man with Ferrano's resources is going to look for a way to redirect pressure. Lucian kept his eyes on the bridge ahead. He's going to look at our cooperation agreement and decide the cleanest way to redirect that pressure is to make our agreement look insufficient. He's going to try to add scope to what the prosecutors are pursuing in a way that makes our cooperation terms look incomplete. He'll go to the AG himself, Garza said slowly. He'll go first, with more, and he'll position it as volunteering information the investigation missed, which makes him a more valuable cooperator than us. He paused. We need to move tomorrow's meeting to tonight. It's 9:30. I know what time it is. Move the meeting. He was pulling up to the mansion when his phone lit up with Garza's callback. The meeting was moved to 11. Reeves had agreed, which told him that the AG's office was as motivated as he was to move quickly, which meant they knew about the Ferrano exposure and were watching to see which direction it broke. Everyone in this game was working with partial information and trying to move before the gaps in their picture became visible to the other players. He walked into the mansion and went directly to his study. He looked at the handwritten pages spread across his desk, the accounting he'd written for himself, the full shape of what he was surrendering. He picked up the last page and read what he'd written at the bottom, in the specific clarity that came at the end of 3 hours of honest documentation. He'd written, "The Empire was already gone when I thought it was beginning. I just couldn't see the walls." He left for the meeting at 10:15. The attorney was already there when he arrived, a man named Coles, who'd been handling Lucian's most serious legal concerns for 11 years, and who had the composure of someone who'd seen every variety of organized crime prosecution and classified this one correctly as a controlled demolition rather than a trial. Reeves arrived with both colleagues and one additional person, a woman introduced only as a liaison from the Financial Crimes Division, whose presence confirmed that what Lucian had provided in the afternoon meeting had been immediately and thoroughly analyzed. The meeting went until 2 in the morning. At the end of it, there was a framework, not an agreement. Those took time and documentation and review, but a framework, a structure, an architecture of what Lucian would provide and what the prosecution would accept and what the scope limitations would look like and what the timeline would be. Reeves walked him out at 2:15, which she didn't have to do, and said in the corridor with the voice of someone making a professional observation rather than a personal one, "You should know that we've had 2 other organizations approach us about cooperation in the past 48 hours. The timing of your coming forward was," she chose the word carefully, "consequential." He understood. He'd moved first, which in this particular game meant he'd shaped the cooperation landscape before the others could. "There's going to be some disruption," Reeves said, "in the next several days. Things moving quickly. You need to be reachable, and you need to have your attorney present whenever you speak to anyone." "I understand," he said. "And Mr. Devereaux." She stopped at the lobby door. "The scope of what you provided tonight, Bashir Kaur, the financial structures, the decision-making chain, the specific authorization records, that's more complete than what we expected." She paused. "Someone built those structures with considerable sophistication." He thought about what to say. He thought about Evelyn's piano and the ghost of another mind in the spreadsheets and the walls he hadn't known were there. "Yes," he said, "she did." He walked out into the 2 in the morning city and stood on the sidewalk and breathed the cold air and thought about Daniel, 5 years old, building things and taking them apart and building them differently. His phone lit up. Unknown number, unknown area code. A text message with no preamble, no identification, 3 words and a location that meant nothing to him yet. 3 words. Come see him. And an address in a city that was not New York, attached to a time, 48 hours from now. That was either the most important appointment he'd ever kept or the beginning of something he had absolutely no framework for and no empire left to bring with him, and nothing to offer except the wreckage of 20 years spent building the wrong things and the possibility, fragile and unguaranteed, that the man standing on the sidewalk at 2 in the morning was different in some essential way from the man who'd walked out of a hospital room 14 months ago and told himself he was coming back. He looked at the address for a long time. Then he got in the car and told Teo a destination that was not the mansion, because he couldn't sleep in that house tonight, not with 48 hours standing between him and something he had no name for yet, but that felt, in the cold air and the quiet of the 2 in the morning city, like the only thing left that mattered. He drove through the night, not toward the address. That was 48 hours away, and he'd learned, across 20 years of operating in a world where arriving too early was as dangerous as arriving too late, to hold a timeline exactly. But he drove because the mansion was impossible, and the hotel was impossible, and the only thing that felt right was motion. The city giving way to highway, giving way to the dark, flat geometry of the interstate at 3 in the morning, the headlights finding 50 yards of road at a time and no more. Teo drove. Lucian sat in the back and did not sleep. He thought about the cooperation framework sitting in Reeves's briefcase. He thought about what Coles had said walking out of the building. "This is going to move fast once it unseals, Lucian. You need to be prepared for the speed of it." And about what fast meant in practical terms. Freeze orders on the remaining assets, investigators arriving at locations, the specific public exposure of a name that had operated for 20 years in the understood absence of public scrutiny. He thought about Ferrano in his 31st floor office with the view, who was going to wake up in a few days and discover that the landscape had shifted decisively while he was managing his 10-day window. He thought about Carlucci, who had been patient and deliberate and had run a 3-year infiltration with operational precision that deserved, in some purely professional sense, acknowledgement. He thought about Rice in a Newark hotel room with 17 browser tabs and a notepad full of anxious writing, who had made the calculation that intelligence was currency and had spent his carefully, and who would probably be fine, which was one of the outcomes of a world where betrayal was rewarded on a sliding scale of usefulness. He thought about Vanessa in the apartment on Park Avenue, which he'd stopped paying for as of 2 days ago, and about Marcus Webb in the coffee shop photographs, and about the child who would be born without knowing who its father was, which was a damage Lucian couldn't calculate and couldn't fix, and had to file in the category of consequences that extended beyond his ability to address. He thought, last and longest, about a 5-year-old named Daniel, who built things and took them apart and built them differently. He checked into a hotel outside the city at 5 in the morning and lay on the bed without undressing and finally slept for 6 hours. The first real sleep he'd had in weeks. The sleep of someone who has made every decision available to them and is now waiting for the decisions to land. He spent the following day with Coles, going through the cooperation materials with the methodical thoroughness that the situation required. The framework from the night before was developing into something more specific: documented scope, enumerated disclosures, the architecture of a legal arrangement that would define the next several years of his life. He signed things. He initialed things. He sat in a conference room and answered questions from 2 federal investigators who arrived at noon with a recorder and the specifically neutral expression of people trained not to react to the content of what they were hearing. At 4 in the afternoon, Coles stepped outside with him and said, "The Ferrano situation." "He moved," Lucian said. "This morning. His attorney contacted the AG's office at 9:15 with an offer to cooperate." Coles paused. They told his attorney they were already in conversation with a primary cooperator whose materials substantially covered the relevant territory. "So, Ferrano's late." "Ferrano's late," Coles confirmed, "which means he's now in a position where he's exposed, but his cooperation value is reduced, and the people he extended the 10-day window to protect are cooperating against him." He looked at Lucian with the expression of a man who has watched a lot of situations resolve in ways that punished miscalculation. "You moved first." "I had help understanding the timeline," Lucian said, thinking about Rice and the 90 minutes in the Newark hotel room. "Well," Coles said, "however you understood it." The unsealing happened faster than even Reeves had indicated. 22 hours after the cooperation framework was initialed, the indictment went public, and with it the specific financial architecture of the Devereaux organization laid out in federal documentation with the clarity of a blueprint. Lucian's name. The structure of the operations. The interface between legitimate and criminal enterprise across 2 decades. All of it in public record by 6 o'clock the following morning. He watched it from the hotel room, the news cycle picking it up and running, the specific gravity of a name that had operated in rumor and controlled information for 20 years, suddenly becoming a matter of public documentation. He watched it with the specific emotional flatness of someone who had already grieved the thing being described. The empire he'd built was gone. That was already true. Seeing it become public was not the ending. The ending had been the morning he'd walked out of a hospital room, and everything since had been the aftermath of that morning arriving in stages. He texted Garza, "Are you clear?" Garza texted back within a minute. "Clear. I spoke to Coles last week. I'm covered." Then after a pause, "Take care of yourself, Lucian." He sat with that for a moment. Garza, who had been with the family for 18 years, who had delivered bad news with the steadiness of someone who understood that the news was not the relationship, who had said, "Take care of yourself" in a text message at 6 in the morning, like a man who was done with the chapter and was putting it down carefully. He got dressed and went downstairs and ate breakfast alone at a table by the window of the hotel restaurant, and it was the most ordinary thing he'd done in years. Just a man at a table, eating eggs, watching traffic build on the road outside. Nobody recognized him. Nobody adjusted their posture when he entered the room. The weight of being Lucien Devereaux, which he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was separate from him, was simply not present in the hotel restaurant. And the absence of it was something he didn't have a word for yet, somewhere between loss and relief. He left at 10. The address was in Philadelphia. He knew before he got there that Evelyn had chosen Philadelphia deliberately. Not her hometown, not New York, somewhere between those 2 points. A city with its own history and its own architecture and its own pace that was entirely hers, chosen because she chose it, belonging to no prior chapter of her life. He thought about this as he crossed into the city, the skyline assembling itself on the horizon. And he thought about the woman who had spent the years of their marriage building escape hatches and contingency structures and legitimate enterprises that could outlast the marriage they were contained in, and who had built an entirely new life in the years since with the same deliberate, unannounced intelligence. She had always known who she was. He had always known who he was. The difference between them was that she'd built something that survived knowing it, and he'd spent 20 years building things that couldn't. The address was a row house in a neighborhood that had the texture of something in the process of becoming. Older buildings renovated alongside newer ones, a street with a coffee shop and a hardware store, and a school at the end of the block. Real neighborhood. The kind of place people chose because they wanted their children to grow up on a street where things happened at human scale. He sat in the car outside for 4 minutes. Then he got out. The door opened before he knocked, which meant she'd seen him arrive. Standing in the doorway was Evelyn, in the particular way of someone who has decided what this is and is holding that decision precisely. She was wearing a dark sweater and her hair was shorter than in the photograph, just past her shoulders, and she looked at him with the same eyes he'd looked into across 12 years of a marriage, and in a hospital elevator, and in the back of the photograph a stranger had sent him from a burner phone. She looked like someone who had rebuilt herself from the foundation and was no longer surprised by what she'd made. "You're on time," she said. "I'm always on time," he said. Something moved through her expression that wasn't quite a smile, the ghost of a thing from a long time ago. She stepped back from the door and he walked in. The house was nothing like the mansion. It was proportioned for actual life. Rooms that were room-sized, furniture that was there because it was useful or because someone had chosen it for reasons of personal preference. Books on shelves that were arranged by the logic of the person who read them. On the walls were framed architectural drawings, some professional and some that were clearly done by a child. Those irregular and confident in the way children's drawings are. The perspective wrong in exactly the ways that made them vivid. He stopped in front of one of the child's drawings. A house. Drawn with careful attention to the details that mattered to its maker. The windows were symmetric. The door was centered. There was a tree on one side that was the same height as the house. "He drew that in March," Evelyn said behind him. "He wanted the windows to match. He started it over 4 times until they did." Lucian looked at the drawing for a moment. "Where is he?" he said. "He's at school until 3. She moved past him into the small living room, not inviting him to follow, but not closing the space either. "We have about 2 hours. He followed her and sat in the chair she indicated, across from the couch where she sat with her hands folded in her lap in the posture of someone who has thought about this conversation and prepared for it, not with a script, but with a clarity about what she would and wouldn't allow it to be. "I saw the news this morning," she said. "Yes." "The cooperation agreement." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "How much are you going to lose?" "Most of it," he said. "The criminal operation is effectively over. The remaining legitimate assets, there are some, ones that were genuinely mine, built on my own decisions, the original operations before the empire expanded. Those are in a complicated position. Some will survive in restructured form. Most won't." He paused. "I'll be comfortable. I won't be what I was." "What you were," she said, "was never what you thought it was." "I know that," he said. "I know it now." She looked at him for a long moment, and he looked back, and in the space between them was 12 years and a hospital corridor and a piano that had collected dust for 14 months and a cooperation agreement signed at 2 in the morning and a 5-year-old who matched his windows. "I'm not going to tell you that it's forgiven," she said. "Because it isn't. What you did, not just the other woman, not just the hospital, but the 12 years of treating what I built as yours, of standing in rooms while people gave you credit for decisions I made, of choosing that over and over and telling yourself it didn't matter because I seemed fine and the money was good." She stopped. Her voice had not broken, but it had done something at the edges, a quality change, the sound of someone speaking from a place they've been to a lot in private. That's a different kind of damage from infidelity. It's quieter. It takes longer to find in yourself. "I know," he said. "I'm not looking for that acknowledgement," she said. "I've said this to my therapist and to Clara and to myself for 5 years. I don't need to say it to you to be finished with it. I already am." She paused. "I'm telling you because you're about to be in Daniel's life in whatever form we agree on, and I need you to understand the difference between the man you were and the man that requires you to be. And I need to know that you understand it, not because you've said the right things, but because I've watched what you've done in the past several weeks." "I attempt to son." He was quiet. "You went to the federal prosecutors," she said, "before Ferrano, before Carlucci made his move. You walked into that building and you put everything on the table when you still had options that didn't require that." She looked at him. "Why?" He thought about what to say. He thought about Daniel's drawing on the wall with the matched windows, and about Evelyn's voice on the phone saying the boy's name is Daniel, he builds things, and about whether those things had been why he'd walked into the building or whether they'd been what he'd discovered was already in motion when he got there. "I'm not sure the reasons are as clean as I'd like them to be," he said. "I'd like to tell you I walked into that building because I'd become someone better. That's only partly true. I also walked into it because it was the only door left and I knew it." He paused. "But when I was in the room providing the information, the thing I kept thinking about was not the empire, not the name, not what I was losing. I kept thinking about the way you built those structures, the intelligence of it, the patience, the fact that you were doing it quietly, without anyone to tell, just because you understood what was needed." He stopped. "I wanted to do something, for once, with that kind of quality. Something that would hold when examined, even if the thing I was doing was dismantling everything I'd made." Evelyn looked at him for a long time after that. Outside, a car went past. Somewhere in the middle distance, a school bell rang, which was wrong, too early for 3 o'clock. And then voices, children's voices, from a direction that suggested a playground. The neighborhood doing what neighborhoods did on a Wednesday afternoon in October. "There are conditions," she said. "I expected there to be." "He doesn't know what you were," she said. "He knows he has a father. He knows you weren't there when he was small and that there are complicated adult reasons for that. He doesn't need to know the specifics at 5 years old. And if and when those specifics become something he can handle, that conversation happens when I say it happens and in the way I say it happens." "Agreed," he said without hesitation. "You don't make promises to him that you can't keep," she said. "You don't show up when it's convenient and disappear when it isn't. You don't be the version of yourself that knows how to be charming and impressive when you want something. You be consistent. You be ordinary. You be the person who shows up on time and does what he said and doesn't make everything about himself." Her voice was steady and had the quality of someone who has thought about each of these things individually. "Those are not negotiable." "I understand," he said. "Lucian." She said his name the way she'd always said his name, with the particular weight of someone who knows a person completely and is choosing to engage with them anyway, which was its own kind of thing. "If you cannot do this, if you find, when the reality of it arrives, that this is not something you're built for, that the consistency and the ordinariness and the showing up without an agenda is beyond what you can sustain, then I need you to tell me that, not to disappear, to tell me, so we can make a different arrangement that protects him." "I won't disappear," he said. "You disappeared from a hospital room," she said. "You were very good at telling yourself you were coming back." The words went in exactly as they were meant to, the precision of someone who had done the work of being honest about what had happened rather than managing the story of it. He didn't flinch from them because flinching would have been a form of performance, and she would have seen it, and he was done performing in rooms where someone could see clearly. "Yes," he said, "I was. I won't do that again. That's all I can offer you. The intention, and the track record I haven't built yet." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The architectural firm hired 2 more people this month. We're doing a community center in West Philadelphia, a school expansion in Camden. There's more work than we can take, which is a problem I didn't expect to have." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she used to talk about the businesses in the early years of their marriage, when he'd actually been paying attention. "I'm not telling you this so you can be impressed. I'm telling you because you asked why I built those structures during the marriage. And the answer is that building things is what I do. It's what I've always done. It was never about you." She paused. "It was just mine, and I wanted it to stay mine." "It should have always been yours," he said. "I should have said that. I should have said it every time someone gave me credit for something you built, and I accepted it." "Yes," she said simply. "You should have. No absolution in the simplicity, no withholding either. Just the clear-eyed acknowledgement of someone who has processed a truth and no longer needs it to be more complicated than it is." At 2:47, a car pulled up outside. Evelyn stood. Something in her posture changed. Not tense, just collected. The specific gathering of a parent preparing to be present for a child. She moved to the window and looked out, and then turned back to Lucian. "He's going to want to know who you are immediately," she said. "He's very direct. He gets that from me." a pause that might, in another context, have been something close to dry humor. Tell him you're a friend of his mother's. That's true, or it's not true. Let him lead the conversation. Don't try to be impressive. I don't know how to not try to be impressive, he said honestly. I know, she said. Try anyway. The front door opened. He was smaller than Lucian had somehow imagined, with the specific physical quality of a 5-year-old who is all energy imperfectly contained in a body that hasn't grown into itself yet. He was wearing a school backpack that was too large for him and a jacket that was slightly muddy at one knee, and he came through the door already talking, telling Evelyn something about a project, a building they were making from cardboard boxes, the words coming fast and overlapping with each other the way children's words do when they've been saving them up since morning. He stopped when he saw Lucian, not afraid, not shy. Just stopped and looked, with the direct and complete attention of a child who hasn't yet learned to look at people sideways. He had Evelyn's coloring, the dark hair, the warm skin, and he had eyes that were the same particular shade of blue that Lucian saw in mirrors, a detail that landed differently in person than it had in the photograph, more solid, more undeniable, less like something from a story, and more like a fact that had been true for 5 years while Lucian was doing other things. Who's that? Daniel said. His name is Lucian, Evelyn said. He's someone I know from a long time ago. Daniel looked at him with the unselfconscious scrutiny of someone whose social filtration system hasn't fully installed yet. Why is he in our house? Because I invited him, Evelyn said. Daniel considered this. He dropped his backpack by the door, which appeared to be its designated location, and walked into the room with the particular purposefulness of a child who has decided to investigate something. He stopped a few feet from Lucian's chair and looked up at him. Are you tall? He said. Fairly, Lucian said. My friend Marcus is the tallest in our class, Daniel said. But he's not very tall. Our teacher is taller than everyone. That's usually how it works, Lucian said. Daniel looked at him for another moment, recalibrating. Do you like buildings? Lucian glanced at the drawing on the wall, the matched windows, the centered door, the tree. I think I'm starting to, he said. Something shifted in the boy's expression, a door opening slightly. I'm making one from cardboard at school. It has 3 floors. We haven't done the roof yet because we ran out of time, but tomorrow we're doing the roof. He paused. Roofs are the hardest part because they have to hold or everything falls. That's true of most structures, Lucian said. Daniel nodded, accepting this as a reasonable observation from an adult who appeared to know about buildings. He turned to Evelyn. Can I have a snack? Kitchen, she said. He went, the backpack remaining by the door, the conversation apparently filed and complete. Lucian watched him go and then looked at Evelyn and found her watching him with the careful attention of someone monitoring a situation they haven't yet classified as safe. He talks a lot, she said. He's good at it, Lucian said. He's good at most things, she said, not with pride's performance, but with the matter-of-fact accuracy of someone stating an observed truth. He's also very sensitive, more than he looks. He doesn't forget things. He'll remember this visit and he'll ask about you, and eventually he'll ask more specific questions. She paused. Be ready for that. I'll try to be, he said. From the kitchen came the sound of the refrigerator opening, a small voice narrating something to no particular audience. The ordinary sounds of a child having a snack in the late afternoon. The sounds of a house that was lived in, that had a child in it, that functioned at a scale appropriate to actual human life. Lucian sat in the chair and listened to those sounds and felt, with a completeness he hadn't expected, the full weight of what he had almost not had. Not the empire. He'd lost that and could catalog the loss clearly. But this specific afternoon light in this specific room with the drawing on the wall and the backpack by the door and the sounds from the kitchen, and the woman sitting across from him who had built all of it from nothing while he was building something that couldn't hold its own weight. This was the thing he'd walked past for 12 years because he hadn't been paying attention. Evelyn, he said. She looked at him. The foundation for the community center in West Philadelphia, he said. I'll have some resources after the legal process concludes. Not what I had, but real resources. If the project needs... He stopped because her expression had shifted into something careful, the look of someone about to reestablish a boundary, and he reoriented. I'm not trying to buy my way in, he said. I know what that would look like, and I know what it would be. I'm asking if there's a way to be useful that doesn't require pretending I have nothing. She was quiet for a moment. The foundation accepts donations, she said, anonymously, like everything else. If you want to give money to a community center in West Philadelphia, give money to a community center in West Philadelphia. She paused. That's not the same as being in this. I know the difference, he said. Show me that you do, she said. Over time, with consistency. Daniel came back from the kitchen with an apple he'd apparently decided to eat in slices, which he was managing with the specific concentration of a person for whom this task required attention. He sat on the floor near the coffee table and began arranging the apple slices in a pattern that was not random, some internal geometry at work. He looked up at Lucian. Are you staying for dinner? Lucian looked at Evelyn. Not tonight, she said. Okay, Daniel said, with the complete equanimity of a child for whom this is a neutral data point rather than a disappointing one. He looked at Lucian. Are you coming back? The question was so direct, so absent of the complicated emotional architecture adults built around questions like that it arrived cleanly and without deflection available. Yes, Lucian said. If your mother says it's all right. Daniel looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Lucian for one long moment, the full length of the look, nothing abbreviated, and then looked at her son. We'll see, she said. To a child, that answer was ambiguous. To a man who'd spent 20 years in rooms where the exact valence of a word decided outcomes, Lucian heard the space inside those two words and understood that the space was real and was being offered, carefully, conditionally, without any promise of what it would become. It was more than he'd come here expecting. It was, he understood, more than he deserved, which was exactly why she'd said it the way she said it. Not as a gift, but as an opening that would remain an opening only if he didn't treat it as one. He left at 4:15. He stood on the sidewalk outside the row house in the October afternoon light and looked at the neighborhood, the coffee shop, the hardware store, the school at the end of the block. And he thought about what Evelyn had built here, not the architectural firm, or the foundation, or the professional accomplishments that would continue to accumulate because that was simply what she did. But this street, this house, this life at human scale with a child who built things with matched windows. She had built the right thing. He drove back toward New York alone, Teo navigating the interstate in the early evening traffic, the skyline assembling on the horizon the way it always had when he returned from wherever he'd been, the specific geometry of it that he'd always associated with his world. His phone had 17 missed calls and 42 messages, the empire's dissolution continuing its procedural progress through lawyers and investigators and journalists and former associates trying to understand their own exposure. There would be months of this, the legal process, the public record, the specific attention that came when a name that had operated in shadow became a matter of public documentation. He'd face it with Coles beside him and do what the cooperation agreement required and navigate what came after with whatever was left. He didn't open the messages. He watched the skyline instead, the city that had feared his name and would now associate his name with a different kind of story, and he thought about a 5-year-old arranging apple slices in a pattern on the floor with an internal geometry that made sense to him, and about a drawing on a wall with matched windows and a centered door, and about a woman who had looked at him for a long moment and said, "We'll see," in the voice of someone who meant exactly what she said, and nothing more and nothing less. The car crossed the bridge. Below, the water moved the way water moves, indifferent, continuous, unimpressed by the names of the people crossing above it. The city lights were beginning to come on in the early dark, the skyline doing what it always did, which was exist. He thought about Carlucci's phrase, "The space your operation used to occupy." Space didn't stay empty. He knew that. Something always moved in, and what moved in would be shaped by what had been there before. And what had been there before was now a matter of federal record, laid out in documentation that would sit in archives long after the people it described were gone. The space his operation had occupied would be filled by something else, run by someone else, functioning by the same logic that had always governed those structures because the logic didn't change just because the names did. He had no illusions about that. He wasn't going to pretend that his cooperation agreement made the world cleaner than it was. What he could say What he could sustain with honesty was this: the specific space that Lucien Devereaux had occupied, the particular damage his specific decisions had created, and the people and institutions and streets and lives that had been shaped by what he'd built. That space was no longer going to be occupied by him. And one afternoon in October, a 5-year-old with blue eyes had looked at him directly and asked if he was coming back, and he had said yes. He would come back. He would show up at the right time and leave at the right time and do what he said and not make everything about himself and be consistent in a way he had never been consistent about anything that didn't benefit him directly. And he would do it not because he'd been transformed into a different person by suffering, because that was not how people worked and he knew it, but because he was the same person making a different choice with full knowledge of the cost of the wrong one. That was all redemption was, in the end. Not transformation, not absolution, just a different choice, made late, made incomplete, made with the full weight of what couldn't be undone pressing against it. The car pulled off the bridge into the city. He thought about Evelyn watching him from the doorway as he walked to the car. She hadn't waved. She'd stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame and looked at him the way she looked at everything she was assessing, fully, without softening the assessment, giving it exactly as much weight as it warranted. He'd looked back. That was all. Just looked back from the sidewalk before getting into the car. And for one moment, they'd been two people looking at each other across everything that had happened and everything that was true and everything that couldn't be changed. And in that moment, there had been something that wasn't forgiveness and wasn't love and wasn't closure, but was something more durable than any of those things. Recognition. Two people who knew each other completely, standing in the aftermath of what that knowing had cost, and choosing, without pretending the choice was easy or clean or arrived at without tremendous damage, to let the small, guarded opening of "we'll see" exist. He checked into a hotel in Midtown that night. Not the mansion. The mansion was in a legal process that would resolve into something he hadn't determined yet, and he didn't want to sleep in it anymore regardless. He ordered food to the room and ate at the desk and looked at the financial documents Coles had sent over, the specific arithmetic of what remained. Less than he'd had. More than most people would ever see. He thought about the community center in West Philadelphia, and about anonymous donations, and about the hospital wing that his investigations had revealed Evelyn's foundation was funding in Camden, and he thought about what it meant to build something that did what it was supposed to do for people who needed it, something that existed entirely on its own terms, that didn't require violence to maintain or fear to sustain. He thought about what it would take to learn that, whether it could be learned, whether a man who'd spent 20 years building things that required fear to sustain could develop the different set of skills and the different relationship with outcomes that building something genuinely good required. He didn't know. He thought he might spend the remaining years trying to find out, not because the trying would make him worthy of anything, but because it was the only direction left that had any purchase on his conscience, and a man needed something with purchase on his conscience, or he was just moving through space waiting to stop. He closed the laptop at midnight. The city was quiet in the way the city was never entirely quiet. Still moving, always moving. The specific continuous motion of 10 million lives in proximity, making the particular sound that had been the soundtrack of his ambitions for 20 years. He thought about Daniel asking if roofs were the hardest part. He thought about what he'd said. That's true of most structures. It was. The roof was what held or failed to hold, what gave everything underneath it a chance to be what it was built to be, or left it exposed to whatever came. He'd spent 20 years building structures without understanding what held them, had been inside walls he hadn't known were there, had stood at the center of something he'd only partially made and believed the whole of it was his. He lay in the dark of the hotel room and he thought about a boy who started buildings over 4 times until the windows matched, who understood at 5 years old that the parts of a thing had to relate to each other correctly or the thing wasn't right, who took structures apart and rebuilt them differently because the first version was only the first draft of what they could be. He closed his eyes. Outside, the city moved. In Philadelphia, in a row house on a street with a school at the end of the block, a child was asleep in a room with drawings on the walls, building things in whatever children build in the quiet of sleep, the internal geometry continuing its patient work. And on a porch somewhere in that same city, or in a room lit by a desk lamp with architectural drawings spread across a surface, or already asleep herself because she had learned in the years since the hospital corridor to sleep cleanly and without the weight of other people's choices pressing on her chest. Evelyn Ashford was living the life she had built for herself with the same patient, unannounced intelligence she had always brought to everything she made. She had built the right thing. She had always been building the right thing. He had just been too busy being the wrong thing to see it, until everything he'd built had made the cost of not seeing it impossible to continue to pay. The city moved outside the window. He breathed. And in the specific dark of a hotel room in a city that had once feared his name, Lucien Devereaux, who had ruled and lost and broken and been broken and walked into a federal building at 2 a.m. to dismantle with his own hands what had taken 20 years to build, did the most ordinary and most difficult thing available to him. He let tomorrow be tomorrow, and he trusted, without certainty and without the armor of power to hide inside, that when it arrived, he would show up for it. That was all. That was, after everything, enough to begin.